When you drive through the pristine, tree-lined suburbs of the American Midwest, you are immediately struck by how uniform and peaceful everything appears. There are perfectly manicured green lawns, white picket fences, and large, beautiful craftsman-style homes where generations of families have raised their kids. We look at these neighborhoods and we assume that the people living inside them are just like the houses themselves, stable, predictable, and safe. But the truth is, suburban architecture is designed specifically to keep the outside world out, which also means it is incredibly effective at keeping secrets in, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not lurking in the deep woods or the dark alleys of a major city. They are sitting right next door, sharing a property line with you, smiling and waving at you across the fence while hiding a reality right beneath their floorboards that would absolutely shatter your understanding of human nature. I am always incredibly fascinated by how far these deep dives travel into the digital wilderness. So while you are getting comfortable, go ahead and let me know in the comments which part of the country or the world you are watching from today. In the late autumn of 2022, a 38-year-old man named Brian moved into a gorgeous, renovated colonial home on Elm Street in a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago, Illinois. Brian was a successful mechanical engineer who had spent the last decade of his life working brutal 60-hour weeks, and this house was his reward. It sat on a massive half-acre lot, flanked by thick oaks that dropped a carpet of deep crimson leaves across his yard. Brian loved the privacy, but more than anything, he loved his neighbors. To his right lived an elderly retired high school history teacher named Arthur. Arthur was a sweet, soft-spoken man in his late 70s who lived completely alone, spent his days tending to his prize-winning hydrangeas, and always wore a faded beige cardigan. He was the quintessential harmless neighborhood grandpa. Because Brian was an engineer, he had a very meticulous mind and a deep obsession with routine. He liked knowing exactly how things worked, and he spent his first few weeks in the house mapping out the plumbing, fixing minor electrical issues, and setting up his basement workshop. His own basement was a standard, clean space with concrete walls and a washer-dryer unit. But because these historic Elm Street homes were built in the early 1920s, they shared an architectural quirk. The basements were incredibly deep, and the heavy concrete foundations were separated by only a thin, shared structural wall underground. By late October, the winter chill had started to settle over Illinois. Brian began spending his evenings down in his basement workshop, restoring old wooden furniture. It was peaceful, silent work. But on a Thursday night, at exactly 11:45 p.m., the silence was broken by a sound that made Brian drop his chisel. It was a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from the other side of the concrete wall, directly from Arthur's basement. It sounded like someone was taking a heavy wooden mallet and swinging it against the floor over and over again. Thud, thud, thud. Brian frowned. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over to the shared wall, pressing his ear against the cold concrete. The sound stopped the exact second his skin touched the wall. He stood there for 3 full minutes, holding his breath, but the house returned to its absolute silence. Brian shrugged it off, figuring that Arthur was probably just running an old, unbalanced washing machine or maybe fixing a broken pipe in the middle of the night. Elderly people often keep strange hours, and Brian did not want to be the intrusive new neighbor who complained about a minor noise. The next night, however, at 2:12 a.m., Brian was jolted awake in his second-story bedroom. It was not the thumping sound this time, it was a vibration. It felt as if a heavy industrial generator had been turned on right next door, causing the floorboards of his own house to hum with an intense, low-frequency energy. Brian got out of bed, patted down the stairs in his bare feet, and walked down into his basement. The humming was significantly louder down there. It was a deep, guttural resonance that made the water in his laundry sink ripple. He walked over to the shared wall again and as he reached out his hand, he realized the concrete was hot to the touch. Not warm, but uncomfortably hot, as if a massive furnace was blasting directly on the other side. He tapped his knuckles against the wall, intending to make a polite but firm sound to let Arthur know the noise was traveling. The moment his knuckles struck the concrete, the humming cut out instantly. The sudden silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight in the room. Brian stood in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for Arthur to tap back. But nothing happened. The next morning, around 10:30 a.m., Brian saw Arthur out in his front yard raking leaves. He looked completely normal, smiling warmly and waving as Brian walked down the driveway. Brian walked over, intending to bring up the noise in a casual, neighborly way. He asked Arthur if his heating system was holding up okay against the cold, mentioning that he had felt some strange vibrations through the shared wall the night before. Arthur stopped raking. His smile did not fade, but his eyes went completely flat, losing all of their warmth. He stared at Brian for a long, agonizingly silent 5 seconds before speaking in his usual gentle whisper. Arthur said that the old houses on Elm Street have a lot of character, but their old pipes like to sing in the dark. He advised Brian that in a neighborhood like this, the secret to a long, peaceful life is learning to tune out the things that happen underground. Then, without another word, he turned around and walked back into his house, locking the front door behind him. Brian stood on the sidewalk, a cold spike of unease settling deep in his stomach. The phrase turned out the things that happen underground felt less like advice and more like a deliberate, chilling instruction. By the time November arrived, the noises had escalated from a nightly nuisance to a terrifying routine. Every single night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the thumping would begin. It would last for precisely 9 minutes, followed by that intense, burning heat radiating through the concrete wall. Brian stopped sleeping. He became obsessed with the wall, sitting in his basement workshop with the lights turned off, staring at the gray concrete in the dark, waiting for the countdown to begin. He began to notice a smell bleeding through the microscopic cracks in the masonry. It was a sweet, cloying odor that smelled like a mixture of rotten fruit and metallic copper. As an engineer, Brian knew exactly what that smell was. It was the scent of organic decomposition. On a Tuesday night in mid-November, Brian decided he could not take it anymore. He had been tracking the noise for weeks, and his patience had completely evaporated. He was exhausted, paranoid, and consumed by a desperate need for answers. He sat on his workshop stool, watching the digital clock on his phone tick toward the fatal mark. 3:32 a.m., 3:33 a.m. Right on cue, the thumping began. Thud, thud, thud. It was louder tonight, so violent that dust was shaking loose from Brian's ceiling joists. But mixed with the thumping, Brian heard something he had never heard before. It was a voice. It was muffled by the thick concrete, but it was undoubtedly a human voice, high-pitched and ragged, weeping and begging for someone to stop. Brian's blood turned to pure ice. He realized with absolute, horrifying certainty that Arthur was not fixing pipes. He was not running an old washing machine. Someone was on the other side of that wall, trapped in the dark, and they were running out of time. Brian grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling so much he could barely input the emergency sequence. He dialed 911. He forced his voice into a whisper, telling the dispatcher that he could hear a violent assault occurring in the basement of his neighbor's house at 42 Elm Street. The dispatcher told him to stay inside, lock his doors, and wait for the authorities to arrive. Brian stood at his basement window, his eyes glued to Arthur's house. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their red and blue lights reflecting off the bare oak trees. Brian ran out to meet them, his chest heaving as he pointed toward Arthur's basement windows. 2 officers walked up the front steps and began knocking heavily on Arthur's door. It took several minutes before the lock clicked and Arthur opened the door. He was wearing his usual beige cardigan, looking confused, fragile, and utterly harmless. Brian watched from the driveway as the officers explained the situation. Arthur nodded meekly, stepping aside and inviting the officers into his home without a single shred of hesitation. Brian waited in the cold night air, certain that the nightmare was finally over. He expected the officers to come bursting out with their weapons drawn, or to call for backup. But 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Finally, the front door opened, and the two officers walked out. They were not running. They looked completely relaxed, even laughing quietly as Arthur waved them goodbye from the porch. Brian ran up to the lead officer, demanding to know what they had found in the basement. The officer looked at Brian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He told Brian that they had done a thorough sweep of the entire basement. He said there was no furnace, no industrial generator, and certainly no one trapped down there. The officer explained that Arthur's basement was completely empty except for an old wooden workbench and a large, heavy brick pizza oven that Arthur used to bake bread. The officer told Brian that the elderly man was just an old teacher living out his retirement, and that Brian needed to get some sleep and stop harassing his neighbors over the sounds of an old foundation settling. The police cruisers drove away, leaving Brian standing alone in the dark under the cold gaze of Arthur, who remained standing on his front porch. Arthur did not look angry. He just tilted his head to the side, smiled his soft grandpa smile, and raised his hand to give Brian a slow, rhythmic wave before stepping back inside. Brian went back into his house, his mind spinning in a chaotic loop. He knew what he had heard. He knew the heat was real. He knew the smell of decomposition was real. He realized that Arthur was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, a master of deception who had somehow managed to hide an entire chamber of horrors from a pair of trained police officers. Brian went down into his basement workshop one last time. He did not turn on the lights. He walked over to the shared concrete wall, his hands pressing against the surface. It was freezing cold now, the heat completely gone. He realized that the police intervention had changed the game. Arthur knew that Brian was watching. The fragile peace of the neighborhood had been shattered, and there would be a heavy consequence for crossing that property line. As Brian stood there in the absolute darkness of his own basement, he heard a sound that made his breath lock in his throat. It was not coming from Arthur's side of the wall anymore. It was coming from his own side, right behind his back, in the far, dark corner of his own workshop where his old water heater sat. He heard the distinct, rhythmic sound of a heavy wooden mallet being lifted and set down against the concrete floor. Thud, thud, thud. And then a soft, familiar, elderly voice whispered through the dark, thanking him for finally coming down to listen. We spend so much of our lives investing in the illusion of security, believing that a good neighborhood, a friendly smile, and a white picket fence are enough to keep the darkness at bay. But we forget that the people who build the deepest walls are often the ones with the most to hide. And when we go digging into the foundations of our neighbors' lives, we have to be prepared for the reality that we might just become part of the structure they are trying to keep buried. Arthur's yard on Elm Street is still the most beautiful on the block, and the hydrangeas always bloom perfectly every spring. But the new family that moved into Brian's house a few months later has already started complaining to the neighborhood association about a strange, rhythmic thumping that happens right around 3 a.m. I am planning to take a drive down that street next week just to see if the air down there still smells like copper, but until then, I think I will be checking the locks on my own basement door tonight. We will be back with another deep dive into the unexplained very soon. Until then, stay safe.
Imagine walking into a freezing, dark cabin in the middle of an isolated forest. You are shivering uncontrollably, starving and terrified. Right in front of you, stacked neatly on the shelves, is enough food to last an entire year. Just outside the door is a full propane tank connected to a heater inside the room. All you have to do is turn a small valve, strike a single match, or open a can of food. But instead of saving your own life, you just lie down in the freezing dark, pull a blanket up to your chin, and slowly waste away. This is not a hypothetical scenario from a horror movie. This is exactly what happened in one of the most baffling, unsettling, and heartbreaking mysteries in American history. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a story format, you have come to the right place. Please take a moment to gently tap the like button and subscribe so you never miss out on these unsettling stories. It was the evening of February 24th, 1978. 5 best friends from Yuba City, California, were piling into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. The air was brisk, but the men were entirely consumed by excitement. These men were Ted Weyer, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, and Bill Sterling. They ranged in age from 24 to 32, and they were a very unique group of friends. Each of them had some form of mild cognitive disability or psychiatric condition, but they were high-functioning, held-down jobs, lived safely at home with their parents, and shared an intense, unbreakable bond over one single passion. That passion was basketball. They had formed their own team called the Gateway Gators. The very next day, they were scheduled to play their first game in a regional Special Olympics tournament. The stakes were incredibly high in their eyes, as the winning team would get a free week-long trip to Los Angeles. They were so thrilled about the tournament that some of them had already carefully laid out their freshly washed uniforms on their beds before leaving the house that evening. They wanted to be completely ready for the morning, but tonight they were taking a short road trip. They were driving 50 miles north to the town of Chico to watch a college basketball game. Jack Madruga was behind the wheel. He loved his car fiercely and drove it with extreme, almost overly cautious care. The college game was lively, and the boys had a fantastic time cheering from the bleachers. The game ended around 10 p.m. Afterward, the group stopped at a small local market just down the street from the gymnasium. The store clerk vividly remembered them. They were cheerful and polite, buying Hostess cherry pies, candy bars, and sodas to snack on during the ride back. It was about 10:30 p.m. when they walked out of the brightly lit store, got back into the Mercury Montego, and drove off into the dark California night. They were supposed to head south, taking a straight, easy, and very familiar highway directly back to Yuba City. Their parents expected them to be home safely in their beds by midnight at the absolute latest. But midnight came and went. The house phones remained silent. The boys did not return. By 6 a.m. the next morning, the parents were awake and frantically calling each other's houses. By 8 a.m., the police had been notified. The authorities initially tried to calm the parents down, suggesting the men had simply taken a detour, perhaps deciding to stay over at a friend's house or got a flat tire. But the mothers and fathers knew better. These 5 men were strict creatures of habit. They never missed a curfew without calling home, and more importantly, they would never, ever risk missing their big basketball tournament that morning. For them to miss the game they had trained months for, something had to be horribly, terribly wrong. Days turned into a week, and a massive search effort across the local highways yielded absolutely nothing. It was as if the turquoise car and the 5 men had vanished off the face of the earth. Then, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the terror. A park ranger reported seeing an abandoned car parked on a remote, unpaved logging road deep inside the Plumas National Forest. The location made absolutely no sense. The car was found 70 miles away from Chico, in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It was high up in the mountains, at a freezing elevation of 4,400 feet. The police rushed to the scene immediately. It was indeed Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego. When investigators arrived at the vehicle, the clues they found shattered every logical theory they had. The car was sitting perfectly upright on the snow-covered dirt road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of any kind of accident or struggle. The keys were missing, But when the police hot-wired the ignition, the engine roared to life immediately. The gas tank was a quarter full. The tires were in perfect condition. The car was slightly bogged down in a shallow snowdrift, but 5 grown men could have easily pushed it out in less than a minute. Even more bizarre, the candy wrappers and empty soda cans from the market in Chico were neatly folded and left inside the cabin. But there was no trace of the 5 men. The authorities were completely baffled. Why would Jack Madruga, a man who hated driving on unfamiliar roads and treated his car like a prized possession, drive up a treacherous, winding, unpaved mountain road in the dead of winter? They were far from home, heading into absolute wilderness, wearing clothes meant for a mild California evening indoors. They were dressed in light windbreakers, jeans, and low-top sneakers. The temperature up on that mountain was plummeting toward 0 degrees. And why, when the car got slightly stuck, did they abandon a perfectly working vehicle that could have provided shelter, safety, and a functioning heater? Shortly after the car was found, the police received a deeply disturbing tip. A local man named Joseph Shones came forward with a story that sounded like a nightmare. He told police that on the exact night the men went missing, he was driving his own truck up that very same logging road. He was looking for the snow line because he wanted to bring his family up for a ski trip that coming weekend. His truck got deeply stuck in the snow. While he was outside, violently shoveling the snow trying to free his tires, he experienced a sudden, massive heart attack. Lying inside his freezing truck, writhing in excruciating pain and entirely convinced he was going to die right there on the mountain, he suddenly saw headlights illuminating the trees from down the road. It was around 11:30 p.m. He saw a car park a short distance behind him. He heard the muffled sound of voices drifting through the freezing air. Desperate for his life, Shones pushed his door open, stepped out of his truck, and yelled for help at the top of his lungs. Through the blinding glare of the headlights, he claimed he saw a group of men, and strangely, a woman holding a baby. But the very moment he called out to them, the voices instantly stopped. The headlights were abruptly shut off. The pitch-black woods went dead silent. Shones called out again, pleading for them to help a dying man. He received absolutely no answer. It was as if the group had dissolved into the shadows. Shones eventually managed to survive the night and painfully walked back down the mountain the next morning to get help. His story baffled investigators. The footprints around Madruga's abandoned car perfectly matched the 5 missing men. But who was the woman with the baby? And why on earth would these 5 friendly, gentle men completely ignore a dying man screaming for help in the pitch-black woods? Before the police could launch a full-scale ground search of the deep forest, severe winter storms battered the mountain range. A brutal blizzard dumped snow continuously for weeks, piling up to 15 feet high in some areas. The search had to be entirely called off. It was too dangerous for the rescue teams. The parents of the 5 men were left in a state of agonizing, unending limbo. Months slowly passed. The heavy snow slowly began to melt as the warmth of spring finally arrived. In early June, exactly 114 days after the men disappeared into the night, a small group of motorcyclists were riding their dirt bikes on a very rough, remote trail deep inside the forest. They were nearly 20 miles uphill from the spot where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came out into a clearing and stumbled upon a United States Forest Service trailer. It was a small, heavy-duty cabin used by park rangers during the summer months. The bikers noticed that the front window of the trailer had been violently broken out. Curious and slightly uneasy, they parked their bikes and looked inside the shattered window. The overwhelming smell of decay hit them first. Then, peering into the gloom, they saw the body. It was Ted Wire. He was lying squarely on a bed, completely wrapped from head to toe in 8 thick sleeping bags and heavy blankets. He was severely emaciated, his body reduced to a skeleton covered in skin, and his feet were completely ruined by severe frostbite. The bikers fled in terror and notified the authorities. When investigators swarmed the remote trailer a few hours later, The scene they documented inside made absolutely no logical sense. It defied human survival instincts. Forensic analysis revealed that Ted Wire had lived inside that dark, freezing trailer for up to 3 agonizing months after the night he went missing. His thick beard growth and the extreme loss of body weight indicated he had survived for many weeks, slowly and painfully starving and freezing to death. But the trailer was fully stocked with emergency supplies. All around the room were heavy winter coats, insulated boots, and extra sleeping bags, all left completely untouched. There was a large propane tank sitting right outside the trailer, directly connected to a large space heater inside. All Ted or his friends had to do was reach out and turn a simple metal valve to flood the room with life-saving heat. The valve was never turned. There were dozens of paperback books, paper materials, and wooden furniture that could have easily been used to start a fire in the fireplace. There were dry matches sitting right on the table in plain sight. No fire was ever made. But the most horrifying discovery of all was the food supply. In a small storage shed directly attached to the outside of the trailer, there was enough freeze-dried food, canned vegetables, fruits, and heavy military rations to comfortably feed all 5 men for an entire year. Investigators found that a tiny handful of cans had been opened and eaten. They were opened with a specialized military P-38 can opener. Gary Mathias, the only Army veteran in the group, was known to carry this exact type of can opener on his keychain. But after those first few cans, the men just stopped eating. The rest of the massive food hoard, literally an arm's length away from where Ted lay dying, was left completely untouched. Ted Wire, a man who weighed over 200 pounds when he vanished after the basketball game, weighed just 73 pounds when he was found wrapped in those blankets. He had slowly starved to death in a room absolutely overflowing with food. The police immediately fanned out to search the surrounding wilderness. Within a few days, the grim discoveries continued. They found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling in a deep drainage ditch along the dirt road leading up to the trailer. Autopsies showed they had died of extreme hypothermia while attempting the grueling 20-mile hike up the mountain in the pitch dark. Further deep into the dense woods, searchers found the scattered, animal-scavenged bones of Jack Hewitt. His jeans and shoes were left nearby, and his father's heavy jacket, which he had been proudly wearing that night, was found discarded miles away. But Gary Mathias, the Army veteran and the most capable survivor of the group, was never found. The only trace of him was his low-top tennis shoes, which were found sitting neatly inside the trailer next to Ted's bed. It appeared that after Ted passed away, or perhaps shortly before, Gary put on Ted's heavier, warmer leather boots, stepped out of the trailer into the unforgiving winter wilderness, and walked away into oblivion. He was never seen or heard from again. The tragedy of the Yuba County Five leaves behind a chilling, impenetrable wall of questions. What terrifying thing drove these 5 men to abandon a perfectly safe working car and march 20 miles uphill through deep, freezing snow into total darkness, wearing nothing but light jackets? Why did they ignore Joseph Shones as he begged for his life? And, most hauntingly, why did the survivors, who actually reached the safety of the trailer, refuse to use the heat, the fire, or the massive pile of food that could have easily saved their lives? Psychologists and investigators have theorized for decades. Some believe the men saw something illegal or terrifying happening on that logging road, perhaps related to the mysterious woman and baby that Shones claimed to have seen. Maybe they genuinely believed they were being hunted in the dark. Their specific cognitive challenges might have caused them to panic entirely, their minds unable to process the fear, leading them to make highly irrational decisions. When they finally reached the Forest Service trailer after hiking for days in the snow, they had to break a window to get inside. It is highly likely They were so deeply afraid of getting in trouble with the law for breaking and entering into government property that their rigid minds refused to allow them to touch the supplies. They might have huddled together in the freezing dark, paralyzed by rules and fear, simply waiting for someone to come save them, until the bitter, cold, and unrelenting hunger slowly took them one by one. Ted Viher, known by his family to lack common sense, but possessing an incredibly gentle soul, might have simply stayed in the bed where his friends tucked him in, patiently waiting for Gary to bring back help that would never arrive. There is a quiet, haunting beauty and immense tragedy in their final days. They never turned on each other. The ones who made it to the cabin tried their best to care for Ted. They tucked him into bed. They wrapped him in every blanket they could find. They stayed by his side in the dark. It speaks to a profound truth about life. Sometimes, the most innocent, trusting, and gentle souls among us are the most vulnerable to the chaotic, unforgiving nature of the world. Life demands a harsh adaptability. A single wrong turn in the dark, a moment of blinding panic, or a stubborn adherence to the rules, even when survival is on the line, can lead to devastating consequences. Their story is a stark reminder that the wilderness does not care about your good intentions, your fears, or your innocence. The physical world is entirely indifferent. The thick mountain forest swallowed their final moments, keeping the true, horrifying sequence of events locked permanently beneath the winter snow. The parents of the 5 men lived out the rest of their days consumed by the agonizing question of what chased their boys up that mountain. And Gary Mathias remains missing to this very day, a ghost wandering the Plumas National Forest. The strange case of the Yuba County 5 remains one of the darkest, most impenetrable mysteries of the American outdoors. There are many more stories hidden in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps the next one will chill you even deeper to the bone.
We've all experienced that fleeting sensation where you are sitting alone in a quiet room and you catch a sudden flicker of movement just off to the side. It is that split second where your brain signals that something shifted in the periphery, but when you whip your head around to catch it, there is absolutely nothing there. Most of us just shrug it off. We tell ourselves it was a trick of the light, a floater in our eye, or maybe just our tired mind playing tricks on us after a long day. We move on with our lives because the alternative is just too uncomfortable to consider. But for a man named Leo, that little smudge of darkness at the edge of his vision was not an optical illusion or a symptom of fatigue. It was the first stage of a predatory countdown that was happening inside his own home. He was about to discover that once you acknowledge the shadow in the corner of your eye, you are inadvertently giving it permission to step out of the blur and into your reality. I am always curious about the different places these stories end up reaching, so before we get into the strange events in Ohio, go ahead and let me know in the comments which city or town you are tuning in from today. In the winter of 2023, Leo was living in a quiet, modern suburban house just outside of Columbus, Ohio. Leo was 32 years old and worked as a successful freelance graphic designer. Because his job involved high-pressure deadlines and a lot of creative focus, Leo was a total night owl. He found that the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. were his most productive. The world was silent, his phone stopped buzzing, and he could lose himself in the glowing light of his dual monitor setup. He was a logical, grounded guy who did not believe in the supernatural. To Leo, everything had a rational explanation, usually rooted in physics or biology. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night around 2:15 a.m. Leo was deep into a complex branding project. His office illuminated only by the soft blue light of his screens and a small desk lamp. To his left, the office door stood slightly ajar, leading out into the pitch-black kitchen. As he reached for his coffee, he saw a tall, thin shape dart across that darkened doorway. It was incredibly fast, appearing like a dark smudge moving through the air, and it vanished into the kitchen before he could even blink. Leo paused, his hand hovering over his mug. He did not feel a surge of fear, just a mild confusion. He rubbed his eyes, thinking that staring at high-contrast graphics for 6 hours straight had finally caught up with him. He took a sip of his coffee, stretched his neck, and went right back to work. He figured it was just his peripheral vision lagging behind his eye movements. But about 20 minutes later, at 2:35 a.m., it happened again. This time, the movement was to his right, near the corner of his walk-in closet. It was the same tall, spindly silhouette, and this time it did not dart away. It seemed to linger for just a heartbeat longer than it should have. It did not look like a person in the traditional sense. It looked like a gap in the room, a vertical sliver of darkness that was significantly darker than the shadows around it. Leo turned his head sharply, staring directly at the spot. The closet door was shut. The corner was empty. He stood up and walked over to the spot, even running his hand along the wall. It was just cold drywall. He decided to do a full sweep of the house just to settle his nerves. He walked through every room, flipping on lights as he went. The front door was deadbolted, the windows were all locked from the inside, and there was no one in the guest room or the basement. He was completely alone. He told himself to stop being paranoid, chalked it up to a lack of sleep, and decided to call it a night. As the following weeks went by, however, the shadow did not go away. In fact, it became a constant, looming presence in his life. It was no longer just a late-night occurrence. He would be brushing his teeth at 7:30 a.m. and see it standing at the far end of the hallway. He would be cooking dinner and catch it huddled in the corner of the dining room. It was always in the periphery. Every time he tried to look at it directly, it would dissolve or slip behind a piece of furniture. Leo did what any sensible person would do. He went to see an eye doctor, convinced he had developed some kind of medical issue. The ophthalmologist ran a battery of tests, but told him his vision was perfect. He then saw a therapist, thinking he was suffering from a stress-induced hallucination, but even as he began to prioritize sleep and reduce his workload, the shadow remained. It felt as if the entity was tethered to his gaze, a dark passenger that was slowly becoming more defined with every passing day. The atmosphere in the house began to change. It was no longer just a visual nuisance. It started to feel like a physical weight. The air in his office would suddenly turn frigid, and he began to experience a persistent, prickly sensation on the back of his neck, as if someone were standing just inches behind him, staring at his spine with a hungry intensity. By the middle of December, the entity had moved closer. On the night of December 14th, at exactly 3:33 a.m., Leo was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and trying to force his racing mind to shut down. He was lying on his side, facing the wall, when he caught sight of the corner of the room in his peripheral vision. The shadow man was standing right there, next to his dresser, but this time, it was not a smudge or a flicker. It was solid. It was a silhouette of a man, standing at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that were far too long and fingers that tapered into sharp, needle-like points. Leo felt his heart drop into his stomach. He was too terrified to turn his head and look at it directly, fearing that a direct gaze would trigger an attack. He stayed perfectly still, watching the creature through the corner of his eye. The shadow began to move. It did not walk with a human gait. It drifted across the floor like a spill of black ink, sliding along the walls until it reached the foot of his bed. Leo could hear a low, mechanical hum vibrating through the mattress, a sound that felt like it was originating from inside his own ears. The creature slowly reached out a long, spindly arm, and as its finger touched the edge of the duvet, the temperature in the room plummeted so sharply that Leo could see his own breath misting in the air. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body locking up as he felt that unnatural coldness spreading through the mattress toward his feet. It was a dense, heavy chill that did not just touch his skin but seemed to sink into his very bones. He could hear the fabric of the duvet crinkling softly, a tiny, rhythmic sound that told him the needle-like fingers of the entity were actually gripping the bed. The mechanical hum grew louder, vibrating through his skull until his teeth began to ache. He lay there for what felt like hours, a prisoner of his own terror, until the first faint light of dawn began to gray the edges of his curtains. When he finally found the courage to sit up and flip the light switch at 6:15 a.m., the room was empty, but the evidence of the night was undeniable. At the foot of his bed, 2 deep, hand-shaped depressions were pressed into the heavy comforter. They were still freezing to the touch, and the white fabric was faintly discolored, as if it had been lightly singed by an invisible flame. Leo did not go to work that day. He sat at his kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee, realizing that his logic was failing him. This was not a medical condition, this was a presence. He spent the next few days in a state of hyper-vigilance. He moved his desk so that his back was against a solid wall, and he kept every light in the house burning 24 hours a day. He thought that by eliminating the shadows, he could eliminate the threat, but he quickly learned that the shadow man did not need a lack of light to exist. He would be sitting in his brightly lit kitchen at noon and see that familiar smudge of darkness standing right next to the refrigerator. It was as if the entity had burned itself into the very fabric of his reality, a permanent glitch in his field of vision. The psychological toll was devastating. Leo stopped eating, his weight dropping rapidly as his anxiety reached a fever pitch. He began to research similar cases online, diving into obscure forums and archived accounts of people who had seen what they called watchers. One specific post caught his eye. It was written by a man who claimed that these entities do not just haunt a location, they haunt a person. The writer explained that the shadow man feeds on acknowledgement. Every time you check the corner, every time you whip your head around to see if it is still there, you are feeding it. You are giving it the energy it needs to become solid. Leo realized with a jolt of horror that he had been doing exactly that. He had been obsessed with it. He had been looking for it in every corner at every hour of the day. He decided right then that he would stop. He would practice a form of radical ignorance. He would see it, but he would not acknowledge it. He would not turn his head. He would not scream. He would act as if he were completely alone in the world. For 3 days, he maintained this absolute discipline. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He would be typing a design proposal and feel the freezing breath of the entity on his neck, but he would keep his eyes fixed on the screen. He would be in the shower and see the long, spindly fingers curling around the edge of the curtain, but he would simply keep washing his hair. He felt like a man walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. By the end of the 3rd day, the house actually felt lighter. The cold spots were fewer, and the mechanical hum had faded into a dull, distant buzz. On the night of December 18th, Leo felt a spark of hope. He sat in his living room around 11:45 p.m., watching a movie to distract himself. He felt relaxed for the first time in months. The room was warm, the lights were low, and he felt like he was finally reclaiming his life. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushions and closed his eyes for just a moment, enjoying the silence. The silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping on his left shoulder. Tap, tap, tap. Leo did not open his eyes. His heart began to hammer against his ribs so hard it was painful, but he kept his breathing slow and steady. He told himself it was just a muscle twitch or a draft. Then he felt a weight sink into the sofa cushion right next to him. The fabric groaned under the pressure of something very heavy sitting down. A scent filled the air, a pungent, cloying smell of ozone and wet earth. A voice, sounding like 1,000 dry leaves being crushed together, whispered directly into his left ear. It was so close that he could feel the cold air of the entity's breath against his lobe. The voice did not sound human. It was a distorted, vibrating sound that seemed to bypass his ears and go straight into his brain. It said, "I know you can feel me, Leo." The tapping on his shoulder stopped, and instead he felt a long, sharp point pressed gently against his jugular vein. Leo realized then that ignoring the shadow had not made it go away. It had only made it desperate for his attention. He sat there, eyes squeezed shut, paralyzed as the needle-like finger began to apply a slow, steady pressure against his throat, and the mechanical hum in the room rose to a deafening shriek that made the windows begin to rattle in their frames. The high-pitched shriek reached a crescendo that felt like a physical assault, a sound so sharp it seemed to vibrate the very fluid in Leo's eyes. He sat frozen on the sofa, his chin tilted upward as that cold, sharp point continued to press into the soft skin of his neck. He knew that if he so much as swallowed, he would be impaled. The cloying scent of wet earth grew thicker, filling his lungs until he felt like he was drowning in the dirt of an open grave. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to open his eyes, to fight or to flee, but he remained a statue, a prisoner of his own radical ignorance. Then the pressure against his throat vanished. The mechanical hum died out instantly, leaving a silence so absolute it was deafening. Leo waited, his eyes still squeezed shut, his heart thumping in the hollow of his chest. He counted to 60, then to 100. Slowly, tentatively, he opened his eyes. The living room was bathed in the warm yellow light of his floor lamp. The movie was still playing on the television, a silent scene of a crowded city street. The sofa cushion next to him was flat, showing no sign that anything had been sitting there. Leo did not feel relieved. He felt a hollow, sinking sensation in his gut. He stood up and walked toward the hallway, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. He reached the bathroom and turned on the light, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked pale, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark circles. He leaned in closer, inspecting the spot on his neck where he had felt the pressure. There was no mark, no scratch, no bruise, nothing. But as he looked at his own eyes in the mirror, he noticed something that made his breath stop. In the reflection of his pupils, in that tiny dark center of his vision, he saw a movement. It was not in the room behind him. It was inside the reflection itself. Deep within the blackness of his own eyes, a tall, spindly silhouette was standing watching him from the inside out. Leo realized with a soul-crushing finality that the shadow man was no longer an external threat. By ignoring it, by refusing to look at it in the corner of his eye, he had given it nowhere else to go but inward. The entity had folded itself into his own consciousness, a dark passenger that was now a permanent part of his biology. He was no longer the one being watched. He was the vessel. He moved out of the house the next morning, but it did not matter. He could live in a stadium under 1,000 floodlights, and it would change nothing. Now, whenever Leo closes his eyes to sleep, he does not see darkness. He sees a long gray hallway with a single tall figure standing at the far end, slowly walking toward him through the static of his own mind. He spends his days in crowded places, surrounding himself with noise and strangers, but he knows that every time he blinks, the figure gets a little closer. He is still alive, still working, still walking among us. But if you ever see a man sitting alone in a bright cafe, staring straight ahead with a look of absolute frozen terror, do not try to catch his eye. He is not looking at you. He is looking at the thing that is finally looking back from behind his own retinas. We spend so much of our lives trying to compartmentalize our fears, believing that if we simply turn our backs on the darkness, it will eventually lose interest and fade away. But some shadows are not cast by the light outside of us. They are the shapes of the things we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves, and the more we try to push them into the periphery, the more they find a way to take root in the one place we can never truly escape. I think I will leave the hallway light on tonight. Sometimes it is better to see what is coming than to let it find a way inside.
There is an unspoken agreement we all silently accept when we walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital. We believe that no matter how chaotic, dangerous, or unpredictable the outside world gets, the emergency room is a sanctuary. It is a fortress built entirely on science, reason, and sterile protocols. If you are bleeding, they have the tools to stop it. If your heart stops beating, they have the technology and the training to restart it. The doctors and nurses in those brightly lit corridors are our protectors. They stand between us and the absolute worst moments of our lives. But what happens when the threat does not come from a bullet wound, a car crash, or a known infection? What happens when the patient you are desperately trying to save suddenly becomes a lethal, impossible biohazard, capable of taking down an entire room of highly trained medical professionals in a matter of seconds? Before we get into this terrifying true medical anomaly, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Riverside, California, in the early months of 1994, was a typical, bustling, suburban hub. The weather in February is usually mild, carrying a slight chill in the evening air that forces people to pull their jackets a little tighter. On the evening of Sunday, February 19th, 1994, the atmosphere inside the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital was steady. It was the kind of busy that seasoned medical staff are completely comfortable with. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant quiet tune. The smell of antiseptic floor cleaner hung heavily in the air. Among the staff on duty that night were people who had dedicated their lives to pulling strangers back from the brink of death. There was an attending physician named Dr. Humberto Ochoa, a man who had seen nearly every trauma imaginable. There was a registered nurse named Susan Kane, known for her steady hands and calm demeanor under intense pressure. And there was a senior medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, a brilliant young doctor who was deeply passionate about emergency medicine. They were a well-oiled machine. They were trained to handle absolute panic with clinical detachment. They were not, however, trained to handle the impossible. Just a few miles away from the bright lights of the hospital, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was living through a nightmare. Gloria was a mother, known to her friends and family as a kind and deeply loving person. But life had recently dealt her an incredibly cruel hand. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. The illness had ravaged her body, bringing with it an immense, unrelenting physical pain that shadowed her every waking moment. Despite the treatments and the brave face she put on for her children, her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Earlier that Sunday evening, Gloria began to experience severe distress. She was sitting in her home when a sudden wave of nausea and shortness of breath overtook her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She became deeply confused, her sentences slurring together as she tried to communicate with her terrified family. Realizing that something was catastrophically wrong, they rushed to the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly. They found Gloria in a state of severe cardiovascular distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed. They immediately loaded her into the back of the ambulance, strapped an oxygen mask over her face to flood her starving lungs with pure oxygen, and began the frantic drive to Riverside General Hospital. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors of the emergency bay burst open. The paramedics rushed the gurney down the hallway, shouting out Gloria's plunging vital signs. The medical team was waiting for them. They immediately directed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, a small enclosed space packed with life-saving equipment. The team swarmed the bed. Dr. Ochoa took command, barking out rapid-fire orders. They needed to stabilize her, and they needed to do it immediately. They quickly injected her with fast-acting sedatives and cardiac drugs designed to slow down a heart that was beating so fast it was failing to pump blood. They pushed Valium and Ativan into her veins. Nothing worked. Her heart rate continued to climb, vibrating in her chest rather than beating. Her lungs were failing. Realizing that she was on the absolute edge of a total collapse, Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to prepare the defibrillator. They needed to deliver a massive electric shock to her chest to reset her heart rhythm. As the nurses moved in to remove Gloria's shirt and place the adhesive defibrillator pads on her chest, A strange, collective pause settled over Trauma Room 1. The medical staff noticed something bizarre. Gloria's skin was covered in an unusual, thick, oily sheen. It did not look like the cold sweat of a dying patient. It looked like a thin layer of grease shining under the harsh overhead lights. At the exact same moment, an incredibly potent and bizarre odor began to fill the small room. It was a sharp, pungent, deeply chemical smell. Some of the nurses later described it as smelling like heavy garlic. Others said it smelled like a mix of ammonia and rotting fruit. It was a smell that made the back of the throat burn. It was a smell that simply did not belong in a sterile, carefully controlled hospital environment. But a patient was slipping away on the table. They could not stop to investigate a strange odor. They had to keep moving. Dr. Ochoa gave the order to draw blood. They needed immediate lab results to figure out what was destroying her organs. Nurse Susan Kane grabbed a fresh syringe, expertly found a vein in Gloria's arm, inserted the needle, and slowly pulled back the plunger. She watched as the dark red blood filled the plastic tube. Susan pulled the vial away, intending to hand it off to a technician. But as she looked at the tube, she froze. She held the vial up to the bright fluorescent lights. Floating inside the dark red liquid were tiny, solid, manila-colored particles. They looked like little crystals. Susan stared at it in complete disbelief. Blood does not crystallize inside the veins of a living human being. It was medically impossible. She leaned in slightly, bringing the vial closer to her face to inspect the bizarre phenomenon. As she did, she caught a direct whiff of the air escaping from the tiny hole at the top of the syringe. Instantly, Susan's face lost all its color. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a stainless steel medical cart. She gasped, telling her colleagues that her face was burning and that the room was violently spinning. Before anyone could reach out to catch her, Susan's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the linoleum floor, completely unconscious. The room erupted. One of the other nurses quickly grabbed Susan by the shoulders and dragged her out of Trauma Room 1, shouting for help. In the chaos, the vial of crystallized blood was handed to the senior resident, Julie Gorkinski. Julie took the warm plastic tube. She looked at the impossible manila crystals floating inside. She too leaned her head down to smell the syringe, trying to identify the chemical odor that was now suffocating the room. A wave of intense, crushing nausea hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt a massive weight pressed down on her chest. The bright lights of the trauma room smeared into blinding streaks. She knew she was about to pass out. She managed to hand the vial to another staff member and staggered out of the room, heading frantically toward the main nurse's station to sit down. She grabbed onto a wooden desk for support, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. Julie collapsed. When her colleagues rushed to her side, they were horrified to see that she was not just unconscious. She was actively seizing. Her body convulsed violently on the hospital floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed. Back inside Trauma Room 1, the nightmare was compounding. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was standing at the head of the bed, manually pumping a bag valve mask to force air into Gloria's failing lungs. Maureen felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her entire body. Her arms grew heavy. The beeping monitors faded into a distant echo. She let go of the mask, took 2 unsteady steps away from the bed, and collapsed face first onto the floor. Within a span of just a few minutes, 3 highly trained medical professionals had dropped to the ground, completely incapacitated by an invisible force radiating from the dying woman on the table. The emergency room descended into pure, unadulterated terror. The staff realized that whatever was killing Gloria Ramirez was now airborne, and it was taking them down one by one. The hospital administration was immediately notified. A code was called over the loudspeakers. The order was given to evacuate the entire emergency department. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. Dozens of patients, some sitting in wheelchairs with broken bones, Some bleeding from lacerations were rushed out of their rooms and wheeled outside into the cold night air of the hospital parking lot. The nurses and doctors set up a makeshift triage center under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. They worked frantically to keep their existing patients alive while simultaneously fleeing the invisible poison that had taken over their building. But inside Trauma Room 1, a small skeleton crew made the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice. Dr. Ochoa and a few brave nurses refused to abandon Gloria. They stayed inside the contaminated zone. They fought a losing battle against her failing heart. They charged the defibrillator and shocked her again and again. They pumped every resuscitation drug they had in the crash cart into her system. They worked in a room that felt like it was actively trying to kill them, taking shallow breaths, fighting through their own dizziness, burning eyes, and overwhelming nausea. Despite their heroic and terrifying efforts, the damage to Gloria's body was too severe. At 8:50 p.m., Dr. Ochoa stepped back from the bed, looked at the flat line on the monitor, and pronounced Gloria Ramirez dead. The medical staff stepped away from her body, exhausted, traumatized, and terrified for their own lives. They carefully stripped off their scrubs, sealed them in hazardous waste bags, and thoroughly scrubbed themselves down in the emergency decontamination showers. The entire emergency room was sealed off behind thick plastic sheeting. The local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department, and eventually, a specialized hazardous materials team, dressed from head to toe in full containment suits. The hazmat team slowly entered the empty, silent hospital wing. They carried highly sensitive equipment designed to detect radiation, poisonous gas leaks, and chemical weapons. They slowly swept the hallways. They tested the air in Trauma Room 1. They tested the surfaces, the medical equipment, and the ventilation system. They found absolutely nothing. There were no toxic chemicals detected. The hospital was completely baffled. Over the next few days, the investigation widened. The county health department stepped in. When the coroner performed the autopsy on Gloria's body, the level of fear was so high that he and his team had to wear custom-made, fully enclosed aluminum protective suits with their own independent oxygen supplies. They performed the procedure inside a specially built, airtight containment chamber. They took tissue samples, blood samples, and tested her organs for every known toxin. Again, they found no evidence of known poisonous gases, no agricultural pesticides, and no radioactive materials. For a brief, insulting moment, the official ruling from the health department was mass hysteria. The officials suggested that the intense stress of working in the emergency room, combined with a strange but harmless smell, caused the staff to experience a localized psychological breakdown. They claimed the fainting was entirely in their heads. The medical staff was furious. You do not seize from a panic attack. More importantly, Julie Gorchinsky, the resident who had handled the blood, spent 2 agonizing weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed severe internal complications. She developed a rare bone condition known as avascular necrosis, which literally caused the bone tissue in her knees to physically die and rot away due to a lack of blood supply. She required months of grueling physical therapy and multiple surgeries just to walk again. A psychological panic attack does not cause human bones to die. Something physical, something incredibly dangerous, had entered their bodies that night. Months later, a complex and terrifying chemical theory finally emerged. It was pieced together by a team of elite scientists at a national laboratory who spent weeks running computer simulations and chemical tests. The theory they proposed suggested a chain of events so unlikely it seemed like dark magic. Gloria was suffering from immense, unending pain due to her advanced cancer. It is highly believed that in her desperation for relief, she may have been using a common home remedy solvent called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, rubbing it directly onto her skin. This solvent is known to be a powerful pain reliever for muscles and joints. It also has a distinct garlic-like odor, and it leaves a thick, oily residue on the skin. This perfectly explained the strange smell and the sheen the nurses noticed when they removed her shirt. But DMSO by itself is not toxic. The deadly transformation happened because of the medical interventions. When the paramedics strapped the oxygen mask to Gloria's face in the ambulance, the intense saturation of pure oxygen in her blood reacted with the DMSO in her system. The oxygen molecules bonded with the solvent, creating a new chemical compound called dimethylsulfone. Dimethylsulfone is known to crystallize at room temperature. This perfectly explained the bizarre manila-colored particles Susan Kane saw floating in the blood tube when it hit the cool air of the emergency room. But even dimethylsulfone is not a deadly poison. The final fatal catalyst happened in Trauma Room 1. When Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to use the defibrillator, the powerful electric shock delivered to Gloria's chest shot through her body and hit the newly formed chemical in her bloodstream. The intense electrical energy rearranged the molecules one last time. It converted the dimethylsulfone into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extraordinarily deadly, heavy, invisible poison gas. It is a blistering agent that destroys human tissue on contact. When Susan Kane drew the blood, that deadly gas bubbled out of the liquid. It entered the air of the small, poorly ventilated room, and it instantly poisoned the medical staff who inhaled it. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark and terrifying exploration of the unpredictable nature of our world. It speaks to the lengths a person will go to find relief from unbearable suffering, reaching for any remedy that might offer just a moment of peace. But more profoundly, it reveals how incredibly fragile the boundaries of our safety really are. We build massive fortresses of science and medicine. We believe we can control the variables of life and death with machines and protocols. Yet, a simple sequence of well-intentioned actions seeking comfort, applying oxygen to help someone breathe, trying to restart a failing heart, can accidentally summon a nightmare. It teaches us a grim lesson about the hidden consequences of our actions. It shows us that every choice we make carries unseen ripples, and sometimes the very things meant to save us are the exact things that seal our fate. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned town in the middle of the American Rust Belt where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of urban explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a very specific type of terror that comes from something that simply cannot happen. We are accustomed to tragedy, and we can process violence or accidents because they leave evidence behind. They leave a trail of cause and effect that our brains can understand. But what happens when the physical laws of our reality just seem to break? Imagine a room with only one door. You set up a camera pointing directly at that door. You watch a person walk through that door into the room. A few minutes later, you watch every single person inside that room walk back out. But the person you watched go in is not among them. You search the room, and it is completely empty. Where did they go? Did they dissolve into the air? Did they step into a crack in the universe? Ah. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what happened to a young man in Ohio, in a case that remains one of the most baffling, logically impossible mysteries ever recorded. Before we dive into the impossible vanishing of this young man, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2006. The city was Columbus, Ohio. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old, and on the surface, his life was moving in a brilliant direction. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a bright, handsome, and deeply intelligent young man with a promising future as a doctor. He had a beautiful girlfriend named Alexis, who was also a medical student, and they were deeply in love. In fact, Brian had recently purchased a ring and was planning to ask Alexis to marry him during an upcoming vacation they had booked to Miami, Florida. They were scheduled to fly out on a Monday, just a few days away. But underneath the surface of this perfect life, Brian was carrying a heavy, suffocating weight. Just 3 weeks prior to this story, Brian had lost his mother to a grueling battle with cancer. He had been incredibly close to her, and her death had left a massive, hollow void in his heart. He was trying to hold it together, pushing through his grueling medical exams and keeping a brave face for his family and Alexis. But the grief was a constant, heavy shadow following him everywhere. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, Brian finished his final medical exams for the quarter. It was the beginning of spring break. He and his father went out to dinner that evening. His father noticed that Brian looked exhausted. The late nights of studying, combined with the raw, unprocessed grief of losing his mother, were clearly taking a toll on him. His father told him he should just go home, get some rest, and pack for his trip to Miami. But Brian declined. He said he was going to meet up with his friend and fellow medical student, Clint, to celebrate the end of their exams. He needed a distraction. He needed to blow off some steam. Around 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. This location is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer impossibility of what was about to happen. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was located inside a large entertainment complex in the University District, but the bar was not on the ground floor. It was located on the second floor of the building. To get into the bar, you had to walk into the ground floor lobby and ride a long escalator up to the second level. At the top of the escalator, there was a small landing and then the main entrance doors leading into the bar. Most importantly, the building was equipped with security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling right outside the Ugly Tuna Saloon. This camera continuously panned back and forth, capturing the top of the escalator, the landing, and the front doors of the bar. It was the only public entrance and the only public exit. If you went into the bar, you were caught on that camera. If you left the bar, you were caught on that camera. Brian and Clint started their night at the Ugly Tuna. They had a few drinks, catching up and enjoying the loud, energetic atmosphere of the college crowd. After a while, they decided to do some bar hopping. They left the Ugly Tuna, went back down the escalator, and visited a few other establishments in the immediate area. They drank, they talked to friends, and they tried to drown out the heavy stress of the past few weeks. As the night wore on, they met up with a female friend named Meredith. The three of them continued their night out, eventually deciding to head back to where they started. At 1:15 a.m., early Saturday morning on April 1st, the security camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloon captured Brian, Clint, and Meredith riding the escalator back up to the second floor. The footage shows them clearly. They step off the escalator, walk across the landing, and disappear through the doors into the crowded bar. The bar was incredibly packed. The music was deafening. The air was hot and humid from hundreds of bodies pressing together, and the drinks were flowing. Clint and Meredith found a spot near the bar, but Brian told them he was going to walk around and see if he could find some other friends. He wandered off into the dense crowd, disappearing into the sea of people. Time slipped away. At 1:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before the bar was scheduled to close for the night, the security camera outside the entrance captured Brian once again. The footage shows Brian stepping out of the front doors of the bar. He walks onto the landing near the top of the escalator. He is talking to two young women. They stand there for a brief moment, chatting. Brian looks totally normal. He is not stumbling. He does not look distressed, and he does not seem to be in any kind of danger. He says goodbye to the two women. The women turn and walk toward the escalator to leave the building. Brian, however, does not follow them. The camera clearly shows him turn around, face the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and walk back toward the doors. He steps out of the frame, heading directly back into the bar. At 2 a.m., the harsh, bright, overhead lights of the Ugly Tuna Saloona turned on. The music abruptly cut off. The bartenders started shouting for everyone to finish their drinks and head toward the exit. It was closing time. Clint and Meredith were standing near the front, waiting for Brian. As the massive crowd began to funnel out of the doors and down the escalator, they kept their eyes peeled for their friend. They watched hundreds of college students shuffle past them. The crowd slowly thinned out until the bar was completely empty. The staff began wiping down the tables and sweeping the floors, but Brian never came out. Clint and Meredith checked the bathrooms. They were empty. They walked around the entire second-floor landing. Nothing. Clint tried calling Brian's cell phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and assuming that Brian had perhaps met up with someone else and left without telling them, or simply decided to walk home to his apartment, Clint and Meredith gave up. They walked down the escalator and went home. Saturday morning arrived. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, called him several times, eager to talk about their trip to Miami. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She thought it was slightly strange, but she figured he was just sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. As the day progressed into evening, and Brian still had not returned any calls from Alexis, Clint, or his father, a cold sense of unease began to settle over the family. Brian was not the type of person to completely ignore his phone, especially not with a major trip coming up. By Sunday, the unease had turned into pure panic. Brian had a flight to catch on Monday morning. He had not been home. His car was still parked at his apartment. His luggage was not packed. Monday morning came. Alexis stood at the airport departure gate in absolute agony, watching the passengers board the flight to Miami. She waited until the very last second, praying she would see Brian running down the terminal. But he never showed up. The plane doors closed, and the plane took off without him. At that exact moment, Alexis knew something was horribly wrong. The family immediately contacted the Columbus police and officially reported Brian Schaefer missing. The police launched an investigation, initially assuming this was a standard case of a young man who had perhaps wandered off and gotten into an accident. They requested the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloona, focusing entirely on the night of Friday, March 31st, and the early hours of Saturday, April 1st. The detectives sat in a dark room. Watching the grainy footage, they saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith ride the escalator up at 1:15 a.m. They fast-forwarded. They watched the footage at 1:55 a.m. They saw Brian walk out, talk to the two women, turn around, and walk back toward the bar entrance. Then, the detectives watched the footage from 2 a.m. until the bar was completely empty. They watched every single person walk out of those doors and go down the escalator. They paused the tape, they rewound it, they watched it again. They focused on every face, every jacket, every gate. Brian Schaefer never walked out. The detectives were baffled. They thought they must have missed something. They implemented a painstaking manual counting process. They counted every single person who went up the escalator that night. Then they counted every single person who came down the escalator. The numbers did not lie. Every single person who went up that night came back down, except for one, Brian. How does a 27-year-old man vanish from a second-floor bar with only one public exit? The police immediately secured the building. They brought in highly trained search dogs. The dogs were given a piece of Brian's unwashed clothing to pick up his scent. The dogs tracked his scent through the ground floor lobby, up the escalator, across the landing, and into the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The dogs wandered around the bar floor, following his path through the crowd. But then, the scent just stopped. The dogs spun in circles, confused. They could not find a trail leading out. It was as if Brian had evaporated into thin air right there on the bar floor. The authorities began to look for alternative exits. If he did not go down the escalator, he had to have left through another door. The only other way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloona was a set of emergency service doors located in the back of the building. These doors were strictly for staff and deliveries. The police investigated the service doors. If Brian had somehow slipped through them without anyone noticing, he would have found himself in a chaotic, highly dangerous environment. The back of the building was a massive, active construction site. It was dark, filled with deep trenches, exposed rebar, concrete pillars, and steep drops. It was a labyrinth of scaffolding and debris. But there was a major problem with this theory. The service doors were not meant for public use. They were heavy, and they opened up to a route that was notoriously difficult to navigate even in the daylight. More importantly, the construction site was heavily monitored by motion-sensitive security cameras to prevent theft. The police pulled every single hour of footage from the construction site cameras for that entire weekend. They watched the tapes, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow, any sign of a person stumbling through the dark. The motion sensors were never tripped. The cameras captured absolutely nothing. Furthermore, police scoured the entire construction zone. They brought the tracking dogs through the debris. They looked down every trench and inside every concrete pipe. They found zero physical evidence that anyone had been there. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no footprints in the mud. The situation was entirely impossible. He did not leave through the front. He did not leave through the back. He was not inside the bar. Desperation set in. Prevent. The police theorized that perhaps Brian had changed his clothes to disguise himself and slipped past the front camera. They meticulously interviewed every single person who was in the bar that night. They tracked down the two women he was seen speaking to at 1:55 a.m. The women confirmed they spoke to him briefly, said goodbye, and left. They had no idea where he went afterward. They checked Brian's bank accounts, his credit cards, and his cell phone records. After the night he vanished, his phone never pinged another cell tower. His credit cards were never swiped. His bank accounts remained completely untouched. He had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The disappearance of Brian Schaefer became a national obsession. It is the ultimate locked room mystery playing out in real life. People analyzed the footage frame by frame, suggesting wild theories. Some believed that Brian, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his mother and the pressure of medical school, had meticulously planned his own disappearance, finding an unseen blind spot in the camera system to escape and start a new life. But his family entirely rejected this. Brian loved Alexis. He was about to propose. He loved his father and his brother. He would never inflict that kind of agonizing pain on them, especially so soon after his mother's death. Others believed he met with foul play inside the bar. They suggested that an altercation occurred in the back rooms, and his body was somehow smuggled out in a trash bin or hidden within the walls of the construction site before the concrete was poured. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete pillars of the new construction, desperate to find an anomaly that might be a human body. The radar found nothing. The Ugly Tuna Saloona eventually closed its doors permanently, but the mystery of what happened inside that building continues to haunt anyone who hears it. This story forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about our lives. We spend all our time building foundations. We go to school, we plan vacations, we buy rings for the people we love, and we operate under the absolute assumption that tomorrow is a guaranteed event. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid. But life is an incredibly fragile, unpredictable current. The physical world can shift in ways we cannot comprehend. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the sincerity of our connections. We never truly know when the last time we speak to someone will be. We never know when a simple goodbye will become a permanent silence. The grief that Brian's family endured, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a door to open that remained shut forever, is a stark reminder to hold the people we care about close. It is a reminder to live with patience, to express our love sincerely, and to never let a disagreement linger into the night, because the universe does not owe us closure. It does not owe us an explanation. Sometimes, the people we love the most simply step out of the frame, and we are left staring at an empty room for the rest of our lives. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive, isolated mountain range where a young boy vanished into thin air, only to be found days later miles away, telling a story about a creature that defies every law of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a profound and unsettling illusion that we all buy into when we visit the great wilderness of the American continent. We pack our expensive gear, we bring our maps, and we stick to the well-worn trails, believing that because we paid an entry fee at a ranger station, the wild has somehow been tamed. We look at the towering mountains and the endless oceans of pine trees, and we see a postcard. But the wilderness is not a park. It is a living, breathing entity that is infinitely older and stronger than we are. It operates on its own set of rules, and it does not care about our sense of safety. Millions of people walk into these forests every year and walk out with beautiful photographs. But every so often, someone walks into the trees, steps just a few feet off the path, and is swallowed whole by the landscape, leaving behind nothing but baffling clues and a silence that haunts their families forever. Before we dive into one of the most perplexing vanishing cases in the history of the national parks, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the morning of October 12th, 1999. The autumn air in Yosemite National Park was crisp and biting, carrying the distinct scent of decaying pine needles and cold granite. Arthur Pendleton, a 34-year-old architect from San Francisco, had planned this weekend trip for months. He was an experienced outdoorsman who respected the mountains, and he wanted to pass that love of nature down to his 7-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a bright, energetic boy with a boundless curiosity about the world. He was wearing bright red hiking boots, a yellow fleece jacket, and carrying his own tiny backpack filled with trail mix and a plastic compass. They had chosen a moderately difficult trail near the Tuolumne Meadows area. It was a route Arthur knew well, offering stunning views of the valley below without being too treacherous for a young boy. They started their hike early, right around 7:30 a.m., when the morning mist was still clinging to the forest floor. For the first few hours, everything was absolutely perfect. They talked about the animals, they pointed out uniquely shaped clouds, and they took breaks to drink water and eat snacks. Leo was having the time of his life, running just a few steps ahead of his father, always staying within sight on the clearly marked dirt path. By early afternoon, the physical exertion was beginning to catch up with him. At roughly 2:45 p.m., Arthur decided it was time to take a long rest before making the final descent back to the parking lot. They found a clearing just off the main trail. It was a beautiful, serene spot, dominated by a massive, gray granite boulder that sat near the edge of a dense line of Douglas fir trees. Arthur took off his heavy pack and set it on the ground. He asked Leo to sit on a flat rock nearby while he got out their sandwiches. Leo, however, was mesmerized by a cluster of bright blue wildflowers growing near the base of the massive boulder. He asked his dad if he could go look at them. Arthur smiled, looked at the area, and saw it was perfectly safe. He told Leo he could look at the flowers, but he had to stay right by the rock and keep talking so Arthur could hear him. Leo skipped over to the boulder, his bright yellow jacket contrasting sharply against the gray stone. Arthur unzipped his backpack, rummaging through the compartments to find their water bottles and the sandwiches he had wrapped in foil that morning. He heard Leo humming a little song, the sound floating gently on the quiet mountain breeze. Arthur looked down into his bag for a few seconds. He moved a spare sweater, found the sandwiches, and pulled them out. The entire action took maybe 10 to 15 seconds. No more than 20. Arthur stood up, holding the food, and turned toward the massive boulder. Leo was gone. Arthur did not immediately panic. He assumed Leo had simply stepped behind the large rock to look at a bug or use the bathroom. Arthur called out his name, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet clearing. There was no answer. Arthur walked over to the boulder, expecting to see Leo hiding behind it with a mischievous grin. But when he rounded the massive stone, there was nothing. The ground behind the rock was covered in a thick layer of dry, crunchy pine needles. There were no footprints. There was no bright yellow jacket. A cold spike of adrenaline hit Arthur's chest. He called out again, louder this time. He yelled Leo's name with the sharp, commanding tone of a parent demanding an immediate response. The only sound that came back to him was the gentle rustling of the wind through the high branches. This is where the story takes its first, deeply unsettling turn. If a child wanders off in a forest, especially a forest floor covered in dry leaves and snapping twigs, they make noise. You can hear the brush moving, you can hear footsteps crunching, and if they fall or get scared, you can hear them cry. But Arthur heard absolutely nothing. It was as if a vacuum had descended over the clearing the moment he looked into his backpack. In a matter of 15 seconds, Leo had vanished completely, leaving zero acoustic footprint. Arthur began to run in frantic circles around the clearing, pushing his way into the thick tree line. He screamed until his throat was raw. He ran 50 yards down the trail, then sprinted 50 yards up the trail. The vast, indifferent silence of Yosemite was suffocating. By 3:30 p.m., blind panic had completely taken over. Arthur realized he was wasting precious daylight. He grabbed his backpack, abandoned the food on the rock, and sprinted down the mountain toward the nearest ranger station as fast as his legs could carry him. He reached the ranger outpost at 4:45 p.m. Breathless, sweating, and crying, he frantically explained the situation to the head ranger. Within minutes, the machinery of a massive search and rescue operation was set into motion. By 6 p.m., a team of 20 armed rangers and expert trackers were at the boulder where Leo was last seen. They set up a grid. They searched the immediate area inch by inch, looking for broken twigs, scuff marks on the rocks, or fibers from Leo's yellow jacket. The trackers were baffled. The dry pine needles around the boulder were entirely undisturbed. There was absolutely no physical indication of which direction the boy had gone. It was physically impossible for a child to move through that terrain without leaving a trace, yet there was none. As the sun began to set, the situation grew infinitely more dangerous. The temperature in the high Sierras drops drastically at night. By 8 p.m., it was near freezing. The search coordinators brought in specialized tracking dogs, bloodhounds trained to follow the faintest human scent over miles of difficult terrain. They gave the dogs one of Leo's unwashed shirts from Arthur's car. The dogs smelled the shirt, put their noses to the ground at the boulder, and began to circle. But then, they did something that seasoned dog handlers describe as highly unusual and deeply unnerving. Instead of picking up a trail and pulling at their leashes, the bloodhounds whined, tucked their tails between their legs, and sat down. They refused to move past the tree line. It was not that they lost the scent. Handlers will tell you that a dog reacting this way is indicating that the scent does not slowly fade away into the woods. The scent simply stops abruptly right at the rock, as if the person ceased to exist at that exact coordinate. The first night passed in agonizing darkness. Arthur sat at the command center, staring blankly at topographic maps, drinking coffee he could not taste, and praying for a miracle. By day 2, the search had exploded into a massive effort. Over 200 volunteers, professional mountaineers, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras joined the hunt. They expanded the search radius to 5 miles, then 10 miles. They checked every ravine, every cave, and every riverbank. The thermal cameras swept the forest floor at night, looking for the tiny heat signature of a little boy huddled in the cold. They found bears, they found deer, but they found absolutely no trace of Leo. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the weather suddenly shifted. A massive, unseasonal storm front rolled over the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and freezing rain began to pour, eventually turning into a heavy snowfall. The search had to be temporarily suspended. Arthur was forced to sit in a cabin, listening to the wind howl, knowing his young son was out there in the freezing whiteout conditions. Statistically, the chances of a 7-year-old surviving 4 days in the freezing wilderness with no shelter and no food were almost zero. When the storm broke on the morning of the 6th day, the search teams went back out, but the mood had shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The snow had covered any remaining tracks. The forest was buried in a foot of pure white silence. Then, on the afternoon of the 7th day, a bizarre radio call came into the command center. A group of elite mountain climbers were scaling a highly dangerous, near-vertical rock face known as the Devil's Tooth. This location was roughly 12 miles away from the boulder where Leo had vanished. More importantly, it was nearly 3,000 feet higher in elevation. The terrain leading to the Devil's Tooth consisted of brutal, jagged scree fields, deep icy rivers, and sheer cliffs. It was an environment that challenged even fully equipped adult professionals. One of the climbers was resting on a narrow ledge halfway up the rock face. He looked over to his right, and sitting neatly on a small, isolated outcropping of rock was a bright yellow fleece jacket. The climber radioed it in. The rescue team immediately dispatched a helicopter to the coordinates. A ranger was lowered down to the ledge. He retrieved the jacket. It belonged to Leo. The discovery sent shockwaves through the search command. How could a 7-year-old boy travel 12 miles through impossibly rugged terrain, cross freezing rivers, and scale a massive cliff wall in a matter of days? Furthermore, the jacket was not snagged on a branch or dropped in a panic. It was folded neatly, almost perfectly, and placed deliberately on the rock. The teams redirected all their resources to the Devil's Tooth. They combed the treacherous area for 2 more agonizing days. They found nothing else. No boots, no backpack, no boy. The location of the jacket made absolutely no logical sense. It defied all known patterns of lost children who typically walk downhill, follow paths of least resistance, and shed clothing haphazardly when they succumb to hypothermia. On the morning of the 10th day, the official search was quietly being scaled back. Arthur was a broken man. The life had been completely drained from his eyes. He was preparing to leave the mountain without his son, a reality that no parent can ever truly accept. Around 11:30 a.m. that day, a lone wildlife photographer was trekking through a densely wooded, swampy basin located about 5 miles in the exact opposite direction of the Devil's Tooth. This area had already been thoroughly searched by dogs and men on the 2nd day. It was a miserable, muddy place filled with thick brambles. The photographer was setting up his tripod when he heard a strange, soft sound coming from a massive, fallen redwood tree nearby. The tree trunk was hollowed out by rot. He approached cautiously, thinking it might be a wounded animal. He peered into the dark cavity of the log. Huddled as far back as possible, trembling violently but breathing, was Leo. The photographer immediately radioed for emergency medical evacuation. Within an hour, Leo was airlifted to a regional hospital. Arthur was rushed to his son's bedside. When Arthur saw Leo, he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. His son was alive. It was a miracle that defied every law of nature and medical science. But as the doctors examined Leo, the miracle quickly morphed into a profound and terrifying mystery. Leo was severely dehydrated and malnourished. But he was alive. However, the physical evidence of his ordeal did not align with reality. Leo was not wearing his bright red hiking boots. He had no socks on. Yet, the soles of his bare feet were completely pristine. There were no cuts, no scratches, no bruises, and no dirt ground into his skin. He had supposedly wandered for 10 days through miles of brutal, jagged rocks, thorny brush, and freezing snow, completely barefoot, yet his feet looked as though he had just stepped out of a bathtub. Furthermore, his clothes, a simple long-sleeve shirt and jeans, were completely dry and entirely clean. There were no mud stains, no grass stains, and no tears in the fabric. He did not smell like a boy who had been living in a wet, rotting log. When the police and child psychologists carefully interviewed Leo a few days later, hoping to understand how he survived and how his jacket ended up on a sheer cliff 12 miles away, Leo's answers sent a deep chill through everyone in the room. Leo explained that he had walked behind the boulder to look at the blue flowers. When he reached out to touch one, a sudden, incredibly thick fog rolled into the clearing out of nowhere. He said the fog was so thick he could not see his own hands. He called out for his dad, but his voice sounded like it was stuffed inside a pillow. Then, Leo said, a man walked out of the fog. But when the psychologist asked what the man looked like, Leo hesitated. He said the man looked like a person, but he was covered in thick, dark fur like a bear, and he had eyes that looked like shiny black stones. Leo said the furry man did not speak with his mouth, but Leo could hear the man's voice inside his head. The voice told him not to be afraid, and that the fog was rising like a flood, and they needed to go up high to stay dry. Leo claimed the furry man picked him up. Leo said the man moved incredibly fast, so fast that the trees blurred together like a painting. They went high up onto a cold rock, where the man told Leo to take off his jacket because the bright yellow color would attract bad things in the sky. Leo neatly folded his jacket and left it there. Then, Leo said he fell asleep in the furry man's arms. When he woke up, he was inside the dark log. The man was gone, and Leo waited there because the voice in his head told him a man with a camera would come to wake him up. The authorities gently pressed Leo, suggesting he had a bad dream, that he had perhaps imagined the furry man to cope with the fear of being alone. But Leo was adamant. He never wavered from his story. The police eventually closed the case, officially listing it as an incredible survival story of a lost child. But off the record, the search and rescue veterans who worked that mountain will tell you that the official report is a lie. They will tell you that a 7-year-old boy cannot survive 10 days in a freezing blizzard. They will tell you that a boy cannot walk for miles without shoes and have flawless feet. They will tell you that the wilderness holds ancient, inexplicable things that do not abide by the laws of our reality. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It speaks to a very quiet, very profound truth about our existence. We move through life with a fragile sense of control, believing that our careful planning and our modern tools can shield us from the unknown. But life is incredibly fragile, and our safety can be dismantled in the span of 15 seconds. It is a harsh lesson in consequences. A single moment of distraction, a brief turning of the head, can alter the trajectory of a life forever. It teaches us about the deep, silent patience of the natural world, a world that watches us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We must walk through life with a sincere respect for the forces that are greater than us, understanding that we are simply guests in a domain that we will never truly conquer. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned mining town where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.